Welcome to the Multipurpose Room, a podcast helping school organizations and school administrations achieve their goals. Each episode discusses real-life topics that PTAs, PTOs, and school staff are dealing with. Our hosts and guests offer practical tips, learnings, and best practices to achieve their desired outcomes. And here are your hosts, Wesley and Deborah Jones.
Did you know that there are 5 generations active in today's economy? That leads to some complexities for communicating with those 5 generations as a PTA or PTO leader. As you all know, our goal as PTA and PTO leaders is to connect with every child, advocate for every child, and provide experiences to every family. Well, it's very difficult to do that if you're not communicating with all the different families. So being an effective communicator is a really critical skill. Today, we're fortunate enough to have the author of Generation Everyone, A Guide to Generational Harmony at Work, School, and Home, Dylan Cockhurst. He has spoken about and written about how to communicate with the different generations active in today's economy and active in today's PTAs and PTOs.
So welcome, Dylan. Thanks for being here today.
Glad to be with you.
I was reading your book last night. It was really interesting. And for people who are listening to the podcast, and you can correct me if I got this wrong, but just as a brief overview, the book is a great overview of the 5 living generations, right? And it goes over what significant historical events took place during each of those generations, how they were parented, how they were raised, and basically how they act and what they respond to as consumers. And you kind of go over your background, and you have a really interesting story in radio. And maybe that's where we can start is, can you jump in to talk a little bit about your background in radio and kind of what led you to start speaking about this topic?
Yeah, I grew up in a radio station. My family, both mom and dad, worked in radio and had the unique opportunity to witness as a 7-year-old the transformation from AM to FM and seeing the first album-oriented rock radio station in Raleigh, North Carolina take to the airways. So I've always had the radio bug, went to school for communications and spent some time in radio after I graduated from school, and eventually ended up working for a fundraising company called Entertainment Publications. You guys might have remembered them, the big coupon books. And I, using my media background, was able to develop a great advertising campaign called One for the Children, which went on the air. And instead of talking about all the bad things that people like to talk about in education, this feature really talked about what was happening that was good in the school systems. And what we would do is we'd do a series of programs that would promote what schools were doing with the money that they raised through the entertainment platform. And, really took off in really highlighting some of those wonderful things that PTAs do with the money that they raise for their schools. After I left entertainment, I ended up spending 10 years at Scholastic. And that's when I became a bit of a generations geek. Scholastic, as you know, is a legacy brand. They've been around for a long time. Matter of fact, they're celebrating their 100th anniversary this year. And it didn't take me long when they put me in charge of the roughly 1.5 million parent PTA volunteers that run the book fairs. It didn't take me too long to see that there was a bit of a disconnect going on with this 100-year-old company and that the way they were communicating with their PTA parents, mostly moms, who were running these book fairs. And I started looking at the different ways that mostly at this time was Millennial and Gen X parents and the way that they were communicating. And it's a lot different than my generation was communicating when my son was in elementary school. So I started really studying the different generations and different generations of parents, and ultimately ended up speaking at education conferences for Scholastic all over the country. And eventually my wife said, you've got to take all this stuff and put it into get it out of your head and put it into a book. And that's when I wrote the book, Generation Everyone.
That's super fascinating. You mentioned that there was a disconnect in the way that Scholastic, this 100-year-old company, was communicating with the parents. What were some of the challenges that disconnect caused?
It's not just a Scholastic thing. It's really most companies that have been around for more than 10 years experience this type of these challenges where it's mostly in communication. I always start every one of my presentations with PTAs or with any organization I'm speaking with, whether it's a corporation, a chamber of commerce, a service organization. It's communications and the way that different generations like to receive information is really what's changed the most. So a good example of Scholastic when we first started going that direction was they were still using a whole lot of heavy print things. The website was not mobile optimized. And again, not badgering Scholastic. This was happening in a lot of legacy brands. And it was just really wasn't resonating with these super busy, high-tech parents in specifically today's elementary school.
That makes a lot of sense. And absolutely not a Scholastic issue. I mean, I see this with all sorts of organizations, with the way that they're communicating. What are the different generations, particularly in the school system, because that's where our listeners are? What are the different generations in the school system that school leaders need to be able to communicate with?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's really broadened over the last decade. Historically, it's been predominantly one generation of parents in a school. So, and usually the parent volunteers were of that same generation. But really what we've seen over the last decade is a broadening of the generational gap in the schools. You've got mostly Millennial and Gen X parents right now in your elementary and middle schools. High school parents are mostly Gen X. But what you're also seeing is Gen Z parents. They just turned 25 this year. They're starting to enter kindergarten. One of the things that's been a positive over the last decade is there's been less teen pregnancy. So there's a less likelihood of Gen Z parents or teen parents, like we saw a lot more of 10 years ago. What you're also seeing is a return to elementary school from boomers and the silent generation. A lot of that has to do with, unfortunately, with the opioid crisis. One wouldn't think that would have a direct impact on elementary schools, but in many cases, grandparents have had to take back control of their grandkids because of the opioid crisis. There was one study I saw recently that said 1.6 million children of opioid-addicted parents are now living with their grandparents. So that's just one example of these boomers and silent generation grandparents coming back into an elementary school that they haven't walked into in probably 30 years. So that's probably the hardest generation for our young parents in schools to communicate with. So many of these schools have these sophisticated school information systems or even Member Hub, where I'm working now for that matter. And you bring someone in who hasn't been in a school for 30 years and tell them they need to log on here, use this username, password, click here, click there, and get all the homework and all that, and their heads will explode. So they also find out that when you're communicating to the different parents, you used to be able to just put, it was the Tuesday backpack when my son was in school. We knew to look in the backpack every Tuesday because that's when important information was coming home printed from the school. But now for a school to effectively communicate with all the generations of the parents, not only do they need to put things in the backpack, they need to post things on their social media. They need to send text. They need to send things through Member Hub or through the SIS and hit them from all different directions because everybody prefers different ways of communicating with their school.
That's a great point, Dylan. You can't talk to millennials the same way you just talk to Gen Xers or baby boomers. And for our listeners that don't know, can you kind of give a overview of all the generations that are coexisting right now and the years that actually make them up as their generation?
For the most part, there's 6 generations living right now. You've got still a few from the greatest generation, which were born before 1924. But what we're really talking about is the 5 generations active in today's economy. And that's your silent generation. Some of them call them the traditionalists. Those were born between 25 and 1945. And then, of course, the boomer generation that everybody hears about was 1946 to 64. And that's roughly about 25% of the economy right now. Gen X, which was my generation, was really from 1976 to 65 or 65 to 76. And they're 2 points lower than the biggest generation right now, which is the millennials. And the millennials are anywhere from 25, and the numbers vary depending on which study you look at. But, I like to say millennials now are, right around 25 years old to right around 40, just getting into their 40s. And of course, 25 and below, that's the Gen Z, which is predominantly very young parents right now. They're just now entering the workforce. They're your college students, high school students, and they're on target by the end of this year to become the largest generation in the world.
And through your experience in writing this book, what are the differences in communication styles between those generations?
I'll go through the primary generations that we're talking about in K-12 right now, which is really the millennials, Gen Xers, and boomers. So if you've got boomers, some of those grandparents coming back into the schools like I told you about, They like the face-to-face communication. They like to receive a personal phone call. Some of them could be offended if they just get sent a text. And I don't know about you, but my dad was famous for this. I would send him a text, just needed a quick answer to a question. And he would call me back. Have you ever texted a boomer and they call you right back on the phone?
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, yeah, they do that all the
time. What do you mean? I just texted you. I know. What do you want? Read the text. But, boomers, they like that face-to-face. They like a phone call. So, if you've got a couple of those boomer grandparents in your classroom, or you're working with some of those boomer volunteers, you might need to pick up the phone and talk with them. They are using Facebook, and, a lot has changed since COVID. Believe it or not, the fastest adopters of Facebook right now are the boomers, and millennials are flocking away from Facebook. So a lot has changed from a communication standpoint. It's really shrunk the problem, because prior to COVID, you were hard pressed to get a boomer to really, communicate really comfortably through Zoom. But now they're all doing it. They've had to do that. They've gotten used to FaceTime, communicating with their loved ones in the retirement homes, for example. So COVID has changed it a lot. If you look at Gen X, my generation, we're the generation of emailers. We're the first ones that heard that you've got mail. Remember those DVDs that used to come in, or the CDs you pop in and download AOL? We remember the first time that somebody sent us a picture through the internet. We sat there and watched it load line by line, and we were so fascinated to get that picture. And so we've become masters of email. We have this love-hate relationship with it. And a typical Gen Xer, if you look at their email inbox, you'll look over on the left, and they've pretty much got a file folder set up for everybody they've ever talked to. That's how my email is. I mean, if I've talked to you for 5 minutes, you got a folder. So email kind of becomes our electronic file cabinet. And, one of my favorite things to do when I speak with PTAs and do trainings for PTAs, I love to have a contest with again, mostly moms that come to my workshops. And I ask them, who has the most unopened emails in your phone? And inevitably, there's somebody in the room that has over 1,000 unopened emails. So I'll say, how do you keep that straight? Oh, I got a separate email for my school stuff. So they use their email very effectively. So if you've got Gen X volunteers, oftentimes they're really good at responding to email. They do like Facebook. They will take phone calls. They're texting. When you talk about millennials, you need to break them up into two categories, because there's a real difference between a 25-year-old and a 40-year-old. I think you'll agree. As they get older, settle down, start having kids, getting into the school system, older millennials are the heaviest users of Facebook. They're the oversharers. I mean, when these four kids get married, there's going to be 75,000 pictures of them growing up. I feel sorry for the slideshows when they go through their wedding. So millennial moms and dads love to share everything. So, it's interesting that it wasn't that long ago when schools administrators were telling their PTAs, you can't have a Facebook page. You can't go on social media because it was such an unknown. And it literally only was 2 or 3 years ago. Now, if a PTA or a school doesn't have a Facebook page, they're really missing out on a lot of communication opportunities, not only with their parents, but the community at large. So, your older millennials, mostly the parents that are in the elementary schools and the middle schools now, Facebook and Facebook Messenger is a great way to communicate with them. They also love quick text. They like the sound bite. If you're going to send an email to a millennial or Gen Z, for that matter, you better keep it short and to the point, 5 or 6 sentences. When you look at Gen Z and the younger millennials, they're all about the apps. We've heard all the stuff going on with TikTok, Snapchat, Instagram. They like to go on there. And what's interesting about Gen Z, our kids for the most part, is they're starting to kind of rebel a little bit against the privacy challenges that their parents so willingly gave through Facebook. That's why I think you see, Snapchat doing as well as it does, because young people know that if they post something on Snapchat, it's viewed and it's gone. If somebody takes a Snapchat, they know about it. So, I think that's one of the reasons that young people today, especially our kids, are kind of flocking away from Facebook. They'll stay on Facebook to keep track of mom and grandma, but now they're, more likely to be communicating quick, sound bites and videos through TikTok and Snapchat.
That makes perfect sense. And I was sort of snickering all the way along, because I definitely saw my parents, myself, my children in all the various stereotypes of each generation that you mentioned. I also had some heart palpitations when you mentioned the woman with 1,000 unopened emails, because that would stress me out.
Deb's bananas anytime there's no unread, or anytime there is any unread
email.
email.
Red bubble, man. There's one in that red bubble. I got to get rid of it.
Yeah.
Any app has a red bubble and I got to open it and find out what it is.
Oh yeah, me too. That's totally my to-do list. So I cannot have that many unopened emails.
I'm clearly on the cusp because it doesn't bother me that much.
If you're thinking about these workshops that you do with PTA parents, what do you tell them in terms of ways to engage? Let's start with other parents to volunteer. Like, what's the best way for them to get volunteers to the PTA across these different generations?
That's a great question. It's always been a challenge as long as I've been in K-12 family engagement, 20 plus years. I mean, it's always been the biggest challenge. How do we get, and how do we recruit volunteers? How do we engage them? How do we keep them happy? How do we get them to come back and do more volunteer work? How do we get away from just these 5 parents doing the work of the whole school? When I was at Scholastic and managing the volunteer engagement at Scholastic, we did a survey with about 5,000 of our parent volunteers, the ones that run the book fairs. And it was interesting. One of the questions we asked for the parents who did not volunteer, we asked them, why don't you volunteer? And the number one reason, which a lot of people are surprised about, is 60% of them were never asked. And every time I say that at the workshops, all the PTA volunteers, they look at me like, what do you mean they weren't asked? We do that all the time. Well, it kind of goes back to the communication. How did you ask them to participate? Did you just put it in the email that went in the backpack? Did you post it on your Facebook page? Again, you've got to ask parents to volunteer in a lot of different ways. One of the biggest ways that you could reach parent volunteers is through the child's teacher. Because when we also ask them that survey, we ask them, how about recognizing volunteers? There's always this question. I know all schools will typically do some sort of volunteer recognition event at the end of the year. Don't know how that's going to go this year with COVID, but they'll give, maybe it's a gift card or some sort of trophy or plaque recognition, things like that. Well, what was interesting is less than 10% of the parents said that they prefer gifts of value. The number one thing that a parent wants to know about their volunteer experience is 68% of them in the survey. They just want to know how their time or their financial investment helps their specific child, teacher, and school in that order. So help me understand how my volunteering is helping my child. How is it helping my child's teacher? And then overall, how is it helping the school? And the older the parents get, the more serious they get about that. Because, we all know that the kindergarten PTAs, they're right? As soon as they come in, you're like, oh, here comes some new parents, and they just want to get involved, and they want to jump in. But by the time you get into, third, fourth grade, you're tired of doing everything for the whole school, right? So you're like, oh, I'm going to keep volunteering, but I'm really going to focus on Jordan's classroom home. So one of the ways you could do that is when you think about what really motivates them is, have you thought about going through the teachers? Instead of the PTA reaching out with a blanket statement, hey, we need volunteers for the book fair, why not go to the individual teachers and have the teachers reach out to those parents and help the teachers explain to those parents how that volunteering for their classroom is going to help the classroom and ultimately help their child. So you got to boil it down from the big picture and bring it down to really how it benefits that parent's child, classroom, and then ultimately the school.
Yeah, so showing impact of the volunteering sounds really critical, as well as using a lot of different ways to communicate. You mentioned communicating through the teachers, which I really love. And to your point, people said that they were never asked to volunteer. I'm sure it was, one line in a flyer or in an email, but we all lead very busy lives. So I think communicating in multiple different ways increases the chances that ask actually gets heard. Because it's one thing to say something, and it's another thing for the person you're saying it to actually hear it. And I think that is really critical and a big part of what we're talking about today, right? As PTA leaders, we want people to hear the message and to have that message resonate with them. And that's not just about volunteers. So I know we just did talk about volunteers, but what about communicating with the parent body generally? Like, do you have any specific tips for Generation X? Like, how do you communicate effectively with Generation X parents and teachers?
Yeah, Gen Xers, that's, again, my generation. We were the latchkey kids. We were the first generation of divorce. So I like to joke that we were the generation that came home from school at 3 o'clock and had a solid 2 hours to run around the neighborhood, break things in the house, and fix it before mom and dad got home, right? So we became, because of that, we were very independent. We don't like to be micromanaged. So completely the opposite of your stereotypical millennial volunteer who needs a lot more, I wouldn't say hand-holding, but they need a lot more direction of what specifically they need to do and how it's going to benefit the overall mission. But Gen X, your Gen X volunteers, they're the ones that once you connect with them and tell them, they're like, tell me what to do and get out of my way. So typically if you've got that independent spirited Gen Xer, which is typically how they are, you can really give them something that you don't have to really follow up on. On the flip side, when you look at millennial parents and millennials in general, first of all, they're the most socially conscious generation we've ever seen. So, the odds are in our favor that the majority of the parents in the schools want to help. They want to give back. They want to do things that matter. So it's very important that when you're asking to participate in a fundraiser, to have them volunteer. It's very important that you're very clear of why you're asking them to do that. Why are we fundraising? What is the specific goal? What are we trying to raise money for? How is my $50 going to benefit, again, going back to my child's classroom, and then overall the school? When we did our survey, going back to the survey, 91% of millennial parents donated to a nonprofit in the past year. So, and that number is probably even higher now with COVID. And 57% of them reported volunteering in the past 3 months. So it's not that they're not volunteering. You just have to connect with them and make sure that they understand specifically, why their volunteer efforts help. And one of the things that really drives, not just millennial volunteers, but really all volunteers, drives them crazy, is if you ask for a lot of volunteers and they show up and you don't really have a clear task for them to do. So one of the things that I teach, and we did this at book fairs very well, is having specific volunteer tasks outlined, we need 5 people to set up the book fair. Here's exactly what it entails. Here's how long it's going to take. And here's why this helps and how it's going to help us be successful in connecting kids with books. So nothing's worse. We've probably all been there. Have you ever been asked to volunteer, whether it's the church or for something, and you show up and you're just standing around? That's not a real fun experience, and you're likely to not enjoy your volunteer experience and won't do it again. So again, it's being very clear, providing handrails and specifically what you need them to do. And another thing that I see in schools today, millennial moms today are busier than ever. These smartphones were supposed to help, and all this technology was supposed to help us get more organized, but, arguably it has not. They're busier than ever, got a million things going on. So, the day of a mom or dad spending a whole week, running a fundraiser or a fun run or something like that, those days are gone. You might find 1 or 2 around, but for the most part, parents are busy. They need to swoop in and swoop out. So if you've got a parent that can only give you an hour a day, awesome. Come up with specific volunteer activities that only require an hour and encourage that. Because if you, and hold to that, if they say they've got an hour and they show up and it's the 59th minute, you better have your foot on their back pushing them out the door. If they want to stay, have them tell you, hey, no, I'm cool. I got another half an hour. Because nothing can burn a volunteer's bridges more than, saying I only need you for an hour, and then you drag it on and keep them there for 2 or 3 hours. So be very clear with what you need and then follow through with that so that they have a pleasurable experience volunteering, tell their friends, and then come back and do it again.
You bring up a really interesting topic and point. It was funny how millennials in this book was even highlighted as, and they're always thought about in that they're the lazy generation, right? The generation that didn't really care. But you brought up some good points about they are really active, engaged, and they're doing a lot of volunteering, which is like opposite to the stereotype that millennials have been receiving for so many years or was thought of as.
Yeah, and 5-6 years ago, it was a bigger problem, because for the most part, the people running the PTAs were your Gen Xers or, maybe some younger baby boomers. And just like bosses, companies tend to be, your higher up leaders at the companies tend to be older Gen Xers or baby boomers. And this is what's kept me in business for the past 5 years is so many companies, schools, organizations, principals, superintendents, there was a study that was done by Q about 2 years ago from just specific superintendents. And only 6% of public school superintendents in the United States feel like that they have a clear understanding of what their millennial teachers need. So there's a big disconnect in that. And I think that's getting a little better. But unfortunately, millennials have been the most hammered generation. And one of my goals every time I speak is to turn that around. Sure, everybody wants to laugh and have a joke on the expense of the millennials. We hear they're self-centered, narcissistic, entitled, lazy, unmotivated, disloyal. They've even been called industry killers. I mean, if you go to Google and type in millennials killing ... there'll be over 1 million articles on there about different brands and products that millennials have killed. I mean, it's unwarranted. When you really look at millennials, they're super passionate. They're very enthusiastic. Just because and one of the biggest challenges I have with baby boomer bosses, if they don't understand that work can be done outside of the hours of 9 to 5. Now, they're certainly learning it now when their flock is not in their cubes. They're learning that it's not uncommon for a millennial mom to show up a little late for work because she had to drop off her kids, at school. She has to leave a little early, maybe take them to soccer practice, take them home, cook them dinner, give them a bath, read them a story, and then they hop right back on email or their phones at 10 o'clock and work slam up to 2 o'clock in the morning. So millennials get stuff done just in a different way that older generations did. So because of that, the stereotypes are that they're lazy. They're not just lazy. They're just working in a different way. They're very independent. They're socially conscious, as I'd already mentioned. And they're quick thinkers. They're information gatherers. I mean, it's like all the traits of an amazing volunteer, an amazing parent, an amazing employee. These millennials possess. So, one of the big things that I want to happen when I'm consulting with schools, with nonprofits and with companies is that they come in with an open mind. I always start with, we're going to learn something today. I'm going to teach you something you probably don't know. I'm going to share with something you probably already do know. And if I've done my job, we'll do both. But the first thing you have to do is understand your own generation. What are the things that kind of shape my values? And maybe those values kind of lead me to believe one way or another about another generation. So once you really open your mind to why you feel the way that you do, and then understand the generational signposts and values of the other generations, then you could have a more open and cohesive group of multi-generational, parents or employees.
And for most of our listeners are going to be either PTA or PTO leaders. For those leaders who are trying to reach all the generations and trying to communicate with them, whether it's to do fundraising or they're trying to get them to volunteer to sign up for an event, can you go over some specific tools and tips of what they should do and how they should outreach to gain these volunteers and to sell to Generation Xers? Can you give a brief overview of some of those tips?
Yeah, I mean, number one, going back to the communication, when you're reaching out to parents, not just when you need something, but all year. Like where I work with Member Hub, we've got this tremendous communications feature, which reaches out to parents through email, through text, through the website. They're able to type in one thing and it shows up on all those different platforms. It's important that you communicate with your parents all the time, consistently, year round, not just when you need something. That's, a big mistake I see in a lot of schools where the primary time that the PTA is reaching out to those parents is when they need volunteers, when they need them to, purchase some wrapping paper or a coupon book or something like that. Granted, COVID has changed everything. I think for the better in that case, that we're seeing a lot more consistency in the way that parents are being communicated with. When you look at some of the older leaders and the Gen Xers that are kind of talking to younger parents, you got to look at, the way you're communicating, the language you're speaking. I like to say, do you speak their language? For example, if you're talking about, meetings they should attend, younger people, millennial parents, they don't want to hear the word meetings. They look for opportunities and experience. Pitching them the PTA dues. No, ask them for an investment and be prepared to explain to them what is the return on that investment, that $10 membership. Don't just say, hey, you pay $10 to join the PTA. What is that $10 going to pay for? How are we going to utilize that to help your child's classroom, help your school, help your child? When you ask for volunteers, even the word volunteer is becoming a little passé. Younger people want to collaborate. They're collaborators. Gen Z is actually kind of coming off as the opposite of that. But young parents, millennials, they love collaboration. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges we've seen with COVID and one of the reasons we're seeing this tremendous spike in mental illness and challenges with the mental state of young people today is they're collaborators. And, having to sit there and do Zoom meetings all day is not good for anybody's mental mental health. And, millennials and Gen Z, for the most part, were already experiencing a bit of a mental health epidemic even prior to COVID. And then finally, asking them to join anything. Remove the word join from your vocabulary. The bottom line is when you look at young parents like millennials don't want to join things. They want to start things. So, and this has been going on for decades. You'll have your hierarchical leaders of the PTA, and they've kind of set in their ways and doing things, and then bring young parents in, and instead of asking their input and how we could do things differently, you kind of expect them to jump on the bandwagon the way it's rolling. And I think looking at corporations like Scholastic and some of these older companies, it's kind of the same way. They've been doing it one way for so long that when new people come into the fold, they automatically expect them to jump on the bandwagon. When you look at, today's consumer-driven economy, young people and young parents today are hardwired to contribute. They don't want to be passive like my parents. Our parents were passive. They didn't question the teachers at all. The teacher's always right. That's not true anymore. You can't say that to a young parent these days. The teacher's always right. They want to be a part of the educational process. They want to know, why are you sending this type of homework home? Why is this? How is this benefiting? How does this help my child in the second grade get into Duke? They want to be much more involved at a very early age. So I know I just probably answered your question in a very long-winded way, but again, if you learn anything from this podcast today, it's really leveraging the different kinds and different ways of communication and broadly communicating in all the different means to reach all of your parents.
And you gave some great tips, particularly for millennial generations with starting something, not necessarily using the words join or volunteer, and really sharing impact. As the PTAs and PTOs become PTSAs and PTSOs, the students get involved, and that's typically at the high school level. We start dealing with the next generation, with Gen Z. Are there similar tips you have for making sure that leaders are communicating in a way that resonates with Gen Z?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm a Kiwanian. I'm a Kiwanis member. And, Kiwanis has a high school organization many of you have heard of called the Key Club. And, as a Kiwanian, we sponsor a Key Club in the high school. And, it's always interesting because I've spoken at the Kiwanis keynote, and then a week later spoke at the Key Club keynote. So it was really interesting, speaking with the boomers in the audience and letting them know how to best communicate with the Gen Z. And then a week later, flipping it around and teaching Gen Z how to communicate with the boomers. But the one thing that people would need to understand, and I see too much of this in marketing, is as Gen Z starts to rise up through the ranks, too many brands and organizations and people, for that matter, are kind of treating Gen Z like mini millennials. And they can't be any farther from the truth. If you look at kind of the signposts and, of course, COVID and all the stuff that's going on now with Gen Z, their generational values are, yet to be determined. But like I said before, Gen Z is taking back a lot more. They're paying much more interest into their privacy. Believe it or not, Gen Z, as young as they are, there's a higher percentage of Gen Zers out there looking into retirement plans now than Gen Xers. And, the primary reason for that is they went through the recession of 2008. They saw their parents lose their homes or lose their jobs, and they don't want to put themselves in that position. And now we've got the same thing kind of happening with COVID. So you could expect these younger generations to be a lot more hyper-focused on kind of the, kind of like a want not, need not mentality. In many ways, Gen Z is trending, at least right now, they're trending to be more like their silent generation grandparents. I look at my son, he's a Gen Z millennial cusper. And cusper might be an interesting term that nobody's heard before, but a cusper is someone who's kind of born right on the line. And I'm technically a cusper. I was born in 1965, the year that the demographers changed it from baby boomers to Gen Xers. So as a baby boomer, Gen X cusper, I was right on the line. So you tend to, the good thing about that is you can communicate across broader lines. But the challenging part is you tend to have one foot in one generation and one in the other. But I see it with my own son, getting back to Gen Z, he's an old soul. I mean, my wife and I joke all the time, these kids don't know how to have fun. I mean, my God. I mean, he's like constantly, worried about money, worried about this and that. And that's because of what's kind of going on in society and what they're seeing. So getting back to your question about engaging, the high school students as they come up through the ranks is, empower them. Yeah, they're a heck of a lot more educated and smarter than we were at that age. I mean, you think about when my generation was brought up, we had 3 news networks, and the news came on at 6 and 6:30 every night, right? So if something happened at 10 o'clock in the morning, we didn't hear about it until 6 o'clock. So now it's social media, and these kids are connected 24/7. When things happen, they're seeing it immediately, and they're much more, I want to say, grown up when it comes to kind of world views than older generations were. So the worst thing you could do with the high school kids is treat them like kids. I mean, I know, yes, they are still kids. In many ways, they need help in, a variety of different ways, but challenge them to challenge you on the way that you did things in the past. And maybe you did the fun run the same way for 10 years. Ask them, bring them in and say, how can we do this different? How can we get more of the kids involved? How can we get more fundraising dollars pledged? Get their input and let them have say-so. The worst thing you could do with a high school, bringing the high school kids into your group is to sit them down in the room and say, this is the way we're going to do things. That's what they hear all day in class. So empower them to contribute. They want to be engaged more so than the millennials did. They're at that age.
Well, and they also have the benefit of having had the internet, a well-developed internet at their fingertips since birth, right? So when they don't know the answer to something, I can bet you that 60 seconds later or 2 minutes later, they know multiple answers to that question because they've been able to look it up, get differing points of view, and, come to their own conclusions. So to your point about the fun run, I mean, they probably can look up the ways 6 different other schools have done it and come up with the best of those 6 ideas. And so they're definitely a resourceful generation, that's for sure.
That's right. And it's funny you brought that up because, one of the first things that the boomers like to do to me when I speak to the older generations is, why are these kids always on their phones? And I have a video, I should share it with you, where I actually looked at my own phone and wrote down all the things that my phone does today for me that required a completely separate product or service when I was a teenager. And it goes on and on. I mean, and when I show that video to them, they're like, wow, they're rarely actually on the phone. They're using it for everything. So I asked them at the end, I said, if you had a device the size of a cigarette pack in your pocket that you could pull out and ask any question on earth and it gives you an answer in less than a second, would you put it down?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And it allows for connection with people all over the world. I mean, there's just so many things. I even think about when I was growing up as a kid, my extended family lived abroad, right? And I would try and talk to my grandma over a landline. It was very expensive to call Poland. We had some language barriers. And now, my kids can talk to their grandparents who don't live nearby
every day
on video every day, even if there were language barriers, which there aren't in our case. But if there were, you at least get facial expressions. You can connect still with nonverbal, whereas that wasn't a thing. And our children have grown up with that since birth. They haven't known a different world.
That's right. It is different. And they're very educated. The millennials were the most educated generation in history, and now Gen Z is going to surpass them. And what's interesting is looking at all the articles that have been coming out of late since COVID. And, the conversations have preceded COVID, but a lot of Gen Z is starting to really question higher education. They're getting to spend, when you have to spend the first 2 years learning all these general course things that really have nothing to do with your major, and then you're rolling out of a 4-year degree with $50,000 on average in college debt. They're starting to really question the value of higher education when there's companies like Google out there that are giving their own 6-month coding classes to kids right out of high school and guaranteeing them starting salaries the same as someone who has a BA or a master's degree. So there's a lot more access to information. I think the biggest challenge, that we all have, is being able to understand that and really be able to decipher what's real and what's not. I think that's probably one of the biggest generation challenges they're going to see in the next 10 years.
Yeah, agreed. If you had to give one closing thought or one piece of advice to a PTA leader or school administrator looking to resonate with the broadest possible audience, what would you tell them?
I think just be open-minded. be inclusive, be aware, understand that every parent, no matter what generation they're from, wants the same thing. They want to raise healthy, happy, successful kids. They just may do it differently. And just because they do it differently doesn't mean that they're doing it wrong. With that said, don't assume all your parents are the same. I mean, they do want positive outcomes for their children. But as I said before, the path they take to get there may be a little different. So embrace that, learn from them, adapt what you're doing to meet the needs, not just different generations, but different types of parents. Understand that today's parents are busier than ever. I can't say that enough. And they're dealing with more stress than parents did 20 years ago. So anything the PTA can do to make their life easier. And that's what we focus on where I'm working now at Member Hub. Every day we set up and we say, how can we create technology or products to help our PTAs, volunteers, help them have an easier time making it easier for their parents. So invest in that. So I guess that's the best thing to do is just to be open-minded, learn from all of your different parents, no matter where they're from, whether it's different demographics, different generations. Diversity is a big thing that we have now that we didn't have 10 years ago. Find out, you may have parents from, I was at a school up in D.C. that when I was at Scholastic and they translated their literacy handouts that we gave them into 17 languages. I'm thinking, wow, that's a lot of different languages here at the school. But imagine how much you can learn if you open your mind to all those different diverse cultures and ask them how they did things or how they want to do things. And just keep an open mind and broaden the way that you're doing things today so that you could be super inclusive and not cut anybody out.
Yeah, I think those are really great points. I loved what you said earlier about understanding your own biases in your own generation first, and then look at the other generations that you may be engaging with and understand them. And I think that understanding and that opening your mind can really lead to true connections and allow you to communicate more effectively. So I thought that was really impactful. And also sharing the why, sharing the impact on the child first, then the classroom, then the school. I like that order that you shared. I think that's really valuable for our listeners. And then finally, I think you had some really great tips around certain words. People don't necessarily want to join anymore. They want to start things. They want to collaborate. Changing your vocabulary or varying your vocabulary and varying your methods of communication can really help resonate with your listeners. So I think that those are all really great tips. Dylan, we appreciate you being here today. Dylan is now, for those of you who probably caught this just at the end there, Dylan is now with Member Hub, which is a great organization focused on making PTAs' lives easier. It's a communication tool. In our 7th episode, we had a PTA leader talk a little bit about Member Hub. So go back and check out that episode for more details on how PTAs are using Member Hub, but you can also check out Member Hub's website.
It's 5-gens.com. I've got some cheat sheets on there that a lot of my PTA leaders found helpful. You can download the generational cheat sheets, which kind of has all the values of each generation. It's a good way to kind of, to your point, learn a little bit about yourself first. But to have those cheat sheets as you're communicating with the different generations can be very helpful. So they're free to download if you want to check out my website.
That's very helpful. I'm sure that those will be a good, useful tool for our listeners to use when they are creating their communications. So thanks again. We've really enjoyed having you.
Make sure to visit our website at themultipurposeroom.school and subscribe to this show. If you like the topics on the show, we share additional resources on our company blog at k12clothing.com and click on blog. Thanks to Squad Locker for making this show possible. And we'll see you next week in the Multipurpose Room.